Hey everyone, sorry for the late start, a little technical difficulties. Let's do a quick sound check, make sure the levels are good between my mic and the song. Can you guys hear both of these? Okay, cool. So there's a little bit of a delay, so I'm going to just go for it. If you guys have questions and I don't see them in the chat, just continue to ask them if they're relevant to the thing that I'm covering. Otherwise, at the end, we can also do some questions. But yeah, so Healer. I have the extended mix open right now. The radio edit pretty much just cuts the intro and outro and then also makes the big chord stabs in the breakdown half as long. And I can talk about why I did that. But if you haven't heard the extended mix, you might notice just a little bit extra stuff going on in that breakdown. But before diving into the super specifics of everything, I think I'm going to cover the vocal first. But before we get into that, I just want to show like the overall structure of the song from a zoomed out point of view. On my Discord, I had some people asking questions beforehand, just stuff that they thought might be interesting to cover for everyone else. And someone asked about the hookiness of the song. Even without the vocal, there's this, ongoing riff that keeps popping in and out. And I just wanted to quickly cover, just from an arrangement perspective, how much I hammer home this one idea. So the idea is the big chord breakdown thing, we've heard it. So the song started off as an instrumental. The vocal came months and months later after I had already sent the instrumental to Anjunadeep. So originally it was just a non-vocal song, and the hook was this little, progression essentially. And before the vocal came into existence, I had to somehow make that gigantic chord stab work earlier on in the song without giving away that huge moment. And I did that mostly with other synths playing that same idea. So at the beginning of the song, super early in the intro, I do that little tease again here. Again during the verse. It's really quiet. Yeah, so I just turned it up a little bit there, but you can see just these MIDI things. I use that piano to basically tease that riff over and over again so that, and occasionally I'll layer it with some chords or some pads as well. But by the time that big breakdown happens, it doesn't seem like it's coming out of nowhere. It doesn't seem like a surprise. But it's the first time we hear it with like all 5 of these layers. So it's humongous. And I think that's really important is in any song, even if it's not trying to be super hooky or super commercial or accessible, whatever, you want to be hammering home one idea, even if it's quietly, subconsciously, whatever, so that when someone finishes the song, if they were to explain it to someone, if they were to hum something or whistle something, whatever, there's a little riff that they can whistle. And if that doesn't exist, your song's probably not going to be super successful. Usually it's just a vocal line. That's the easiest way to do it. But if it's not a vocal and it's, a melodic riff or like a motif, you want to, subconsciously have the listener already, getting it stuck in their head by the time it like really hits them halfway through the song. So I just wanted to cover that because a lot of music that I get sent has like strong melodic ideas, but maybe there's 3 of them and they just kind of trade off throughout the whole song. But by the end of the song, I don't even know how I would sing it or how it would get stuck in my head. You know, you want that earworm part of it to be very clear cut, and that's kind of like the key to strong songwriting, in my opinion. Okay, so that's just my little rant. We can go into the vocals. So there's a couple different things happening with the vocals. Shobi, who did a great job providing me with, well, a great job on the vocal, but also just providing me a lot of takes and a lot of harmonies and doubles. And that's another thing I think you might not realize as a up and coming producer is how many stacks of vocals go into, you know, one vocal performance. So if you really listen closely to pretty much any song ever, except maybe like a very intimate ballad, you're gonna hear multiple takes of the same vocal kind of glued together. It's so prominent in pop music now that the sound we associate with a vocal isn't even someone's actual voice. And that's why like acoustic performances sound so different. It's usually like 3 layers stacked on top of each other, widened, slightly detuned, or naturally detuned because it's 3 different performances. And that together creates this chorus effect that we almost hear as, you know, a quote unquote normal vocal because it's been happening for 50 years in pop music. So just to show you all the different layers right now, we've got the first verse is just a low version. Time to let. Then we have this harmony. Time to let. And then we've got this octave. Time to let. And at no point do I just use one of those layers. The whole time, the whole verse is all 3 of them. But you can see I do automate it, the high octave down at the beginning, so that the first 2 phrases, it's not super noticeable, and then the second 2, it gets a lot louder, and that's because I wanted some kind of dynamic change so that there's like a little bit of variation. It feels like it's growing, you know? So together, time to let. So the main one is more prominent, but time to let. There's a clear difference when we add all of them. Time to let go of the past ghosts. And then when this comes louder, look ahead and pave a new path for me. So if we didn't have these other harmonies in the octave, it would be pretty lackluster. Even though she has a great voice, we're just so used to hearing harmonies and octaves together, or at least doubles, that it's weird when you hear it without that. And pave a new path for me. And then without them. And pave a new path for me. So I'm going to keep hammering home this idea, and it's because so many people are like, what's your vocal processing chain? Secret vocal mixing tips. And especially on YouTube, there's so many, you know, music production vocal tips, and it's all about plugins and processing and all this stuff. And that's so unimportant relative to getting multiple takes, using multiple takes, stacking and layering. The whole idea of double tracking, stacking, layering, all this stuff we'll get into is like 80% of the battle when trying to get a good vocal. And the performance itself. If someone's singing and they don't have that emotion in their voice, they don't have the power or like the melancholy in their voice, you can't add that with a plugin. So, you know, if you're hanging out with your friend and he's like, or she's like, oh, let me sing over this track, and you guys just do one take and you're like, this is awesome, let's start working, you've already messed up. You should be taking 4, 5, 6 takes, making sure they're all good so you can actually use them, then asking him or her to do, you know, a harmony, an octave. There's just so much to it that is about the performance that I can't understate enough, because you can make up for it with plugins a little bit, but there's nothing that beats the real thing. So on the same note, we can go to the little hook, which is those ooh things, and this is 4 layers. We've got the main one, we've got a different take. Notice these are not duplicates, these are separate takes. This is panned almost all the way to the left, and the other one's almost all the way to the right. And because they're different takes, when they're pan super wide, if they go to mono, it's not necessarily going to collapse or have any phase problems or have as many. But if it was the exact duplicate take and you put it to mono, well, sorry, I misspoke. The exact duplicate take wouldn't really collapse in mono, but it wouldn't provide the width you're looking for. So the only reason something panned hard left and hard right actually feels left and right is if they're different. If you take the exact same thing, pan it left and right, you're not going to get the width. And then the fact that they're different takes, when we do collapse it, it'll just kind of give this chorus effect in mono. But anyway, so those are left and right for width, and then we have this lower take. This is one I think I asked her to do. So she was doing all these high octaves, and I was like, this is amazing, but to give the hook more body, it would be nice if you could try to do this an octave lower. So she sent this over, and this kind of rounds it out. So without that lower octave, and then with it, it's really subtle, but it just kind of helps give it like a little bit more warmth. But yeah, I'm not going into the processing yet just because this is like what really sets it apart, I think. Like, you know, you can use all the widening plugins in the world, but if you have 3 separate voices, left, right, and center, that's going to literally sound like there's 3 people, or like, you know, this chorus or choral effect where it's like a group of people all standing singing together. And then this is also doubled with a low and a high.
Now it's my turn to. Now it's my turn to be. Now it's my turn to be happy.
And then the other things that were added to it were high octave to the left, high octave to the right. And then I had her also do a whisper take, which is something, I don't know where I picked this up from, someone a couple years ago, but I do this in a lot of my vocal tracks, where I try to get like a wispier version just to be able to essentially have channels that I can just turn up if I want it airier or turn down without having to resort to like an EQ or something. And I should mention, I had to, you know, some of these are not warped, some of them are. So it's not easy to sing perfectly in time with yourself 5 times in a row. So there were a lot of times where I had to warp these so that it would line up. It doesn't need to be perfect, but you don't want a bunch of T's or C's or S's slightly off, because then it, you know, you're going to hear it. It's going to sound a little messy. And when you are warping vocals, I think complex is the way to go. If you do beats mode, it's going to create these weird like glitches. Tones also sometimes works, but I'm not the biggest fan. Let's see. And then we can also show with these two. So these are both left, right. So I just called these the doubles, but then they're still getting layered on top of the main ones.
Now it's my turn to be happy.
So that choral effect of multiple people singing, you can get it with plugins that do doubling or do spreading, but it sounds so good when it's the real thing. So we can get into the processing of the vocals now, but I'll look at the chat if anyone has questions. Someone's asking about auto-tune. So these have actually all been tuned. So I use Waves Tune real time. I keep the correction between like 60 and 80 or 90. Usually slow the speed and the transition down so that it doesn't feel like T-Pain style auto-tune, you know? I want it to be natural, at least for this. So these are all slightly tuned, more or less. Some of them are not. Sometimes the ones that are getting spread, I choose not to tune, because if you want the left and right sides to be distinctly different so that the width comes across, tuning them is going to make them closer together. So as long as they sound good and they're not, you know, drastically out of tune, I like to either keep them untuned or in the tuning application, just bring the correction way down. So it's just doing a little bit. and that way the left side stays more distinct from the right side, and you get that thing of width. So people are asking about what did I tackle first when making it, and how much of the time was spent on the vocal. So the track was originally an instrumental. I sent it to Anjuna as an instrumental. They said, hey, this could be cool with the vocal. And I was like, yeah, that's not a bad idea. Maybe I just take out some of the intensity of these like chords and make some room for the vocal. And they linked me with the vocalist Shobi, who has worked with them before as another alias. And it's hard to say how much time I spent on both aspects, but the vocal did come together fairly quickly. She did a really good job coming up with like the lyrics, the idea, and the melodies, and then I was just able to mix it fairly quickly. But there was, however many months of small fine tuning, resting my ears, coming back to it, fine tuning some more. But I would say the instrumental was definitely the more labor-intensive part. Someone's asking about groove pool on melodic elements and vocals. I don't try to quantize the vocals or use the groove on them. Hopefully the vocalist will perform it in a way that is synced enough, close enough to the grid, and also if the swing is so heavy that it makes sense for the vocal to follow that, you would hope the vocalist is doing it. I think as little warping as possible, and only what's absolutely necessary is the way to go with vocals, because you want them to sound natural, and it's rare that you would hear someone singing so perfectly on the grid or matching the swing that if you were to do that, it would sound unnatural, because that's not what we're used to hearing. Yeah, and the vocalist Shobi, she wrote the lyrics. I think I had some suggestions, and we worked through that. She also wrote some of the top line bits, and I think I had like one or two suggestions of like maybe ending a phrase going high instead of low or something, some small adjustments. And then we kind of went back and forth a little bit on email, but she definitely, like, the first thing that she came up with was most of what you hear now. Cool. I think that's good for questions for now. So for processing, I kept them in separate groups, mostly so that I could lump processing together and save CPU and just have it be consistent. So the main verse is one, and that includes the doubles, the low verse. Then the higher octave is separate processing because it's different frequency range, different levels. And then the hook is also different processing because it's very breathy and a little resonant because she's staying on one note for so long. So rather than do every single track, I just grouped the ones that made sense to be processed in a similar manner, and then did the processing on the group. It's mostly, so this channel strip has some EQ and some compression on it, but it's all very small touches, like you can see. So for the oohs, I was bringing up the lows a good amount, and I'm using this channel strip because it's built to sound better than if you were to try to do all these things separately, because this is based off of analog hardware. It has specific frequency points. You can scroll between them, but it's built off a piece of hardware that was created to sound good, to be intuitive, etc. I think there is something to be said about using plugins that are modeled off of analog gear because they have less options. They're more limited, and they're limited specifically to sound good. They've been used for 30, 40 years in professional studios. And nowadays, certain companies like Brainworks, Plugin Alliance, Universal Audio, Slate, but I don't use Slate, but I've heard they're good. They can emulate some of these hardware things so well that it makes sense to use them. So I like using those on vocals. EQ, this was just dipping out some of the resonant things, and I prefer to use EQ, dynamic EQ, than a de-esser or something like that. But because she was sitting on those notes for so long, I wanted to make sure they weren't poking out of the mix too much. And this was a lot of testing on different systems. So like AirPods, my car, it sounded great in my studio. Then I listened on the AirPods, and those oohs were like really harsh in the mids. So I ended up making those dips. Then compression. This is mostly just to level off some of like the beginning of sounds and then the tails of sounds, because this is the hook. So I wanted the oohs to like come across at even volumes, and you know, for the tails to be equally loud and all of that. So we're getting 5 dBs of gain reduction and then another 5. And I started off with a slow attack, so this just it lets the transients come through and the initial parts come through, but then kind of evens out like I was just saying. And then this next compressor clamps down on those initial parts with a super fast attack and a really high ratio. So once it's kind of smoothed, ideally this second compressor should only be operating on some of like those initial parts where she's like a little bit louder. And then just kind of sitting there. But because it's sitting right at 5 and I have 5 dBs of makeup gain, it's acting as if not much is happening from like a volume perspective. And I could get on a tangent with gain staging, but essentially a good tip in a nutshell, gain staging, you kind of want whatever plugin you're using to not add additional gain or loudness from just increasing the gain. So it's fine if it feels louder because you're bringing up the tail through a compressor or because you're saturating, whatever. But you know, you don't want to just have 5 dBs of gain reduction and then just crank this up to 12 to 13, whatever, and say, oh, it sounds so good, because it's actually just louder and that's why you think it sounds so good. Gain staging, one of the most important things in production, very undereducated, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now. Neutron Sculptor, I think I don't really use this much anymore because I didn't really like what it was doing to stuff, but on vocals I think it works because it just can kind of even out some of these resonant areas and add a little bit of air. But again, this is doing barely anything. I think the key with vocals and with most things is to make sure all of your plugins are just doing a little bit of incremental work rather than anything working way too hard, because the harder a plugin works, the more likely there's going to be problems where it can be working too hard and starts to distort or just starts to sound unnatural. Let me mute the rest for now. So we've got this nice dry vocal, but it's already sounding lush because of all the doubles that we have. This decapitator, it's about half wet, and this is just to give it some edge, a little bit of body. So it's actually taking away some of the air. It's high cut a little bit, and the tone is headed towards dark. And I think that's because after a lot more of the processing I noticed it was a little too bright, a little too harsh. So I just kind of toned down earlier in the chain until it sounded right to my ears. But yeah, just a little bit of extra warmth. This was more controlling of the different resonant peaks and some of the de-essing up here. And I think this just comes from, once it's in the mix, noticing like what are the problem areas and then trying to fix them. So I'm usually doing a lot of this mix stuff with all the channels on. I'm just showing you solos so you can hear the difference. This also really subtle, but overdrive at really low dry wets, like 1 to 7, 8%, can be really useful because you can filter exactly what frequencies you want to be driven and then, you know, mess with these until it sounds right. But this helps give vocals, my synths, a little bit more edge in those upper mids or in the mid range. But this one is really subtle. And I automate it to be a little bit louder here. So I think it's more that I didn't really need it here, But in the final drop, when there's so much else going on, so many drums, so much other brightness, that I felt it needed this lift. So it's a little more noticeable there. Yeah, so you can hear it kind of gets a little tinnier, a little bit more energy in that like 1 to 2K range. And if you don't notice a lot of these differences that I'm doing, I think that's potentially the internet connection. More likely though, it's just your ear isn't necessarily trained to like pick up these tiny little things, because the more you produce, the more experience you get, the more you realize, or the more you hear really. Like it's hard to explain until you're reaching that point where you can just notice more in a mix, you can just hear more. It's truly just a factor of time and experience. But then you start making all your plugins work less and less because you can hear exactly what they're doing. You don't need to push them so hard to hear the difference. So don't be discouraged if you can't really hear a big difference with these, because it is super subtle. Okay, so then we get into some of the reverb. So there's a tiny bit of reverb and delay coming from these return channels, but it still feels pretty dry, right? And I wanted this hook to kind of sit in the background, but still be up front. So we need a reverb to kind of give it this lushness. But I like shimmer because it kind of has this natural pre-delay so that the main signal still sort of feels up front at low mixes, and you just get this really angelic tail. So you can hear that nice. And it kind of comes after the initial hit. And then the feedback, this controls if there's going to be a pitch change. So shimmer is also, it creates like you can have like a higher octave of the reverb. It's based off this Eventide pedal. And I just automate that leading into a breakdown and into the main, or the first drop. So you can hear how that sounds. I'll just crank it. So that angelic tail thing slowly sweeps up, and that kind of creates this natural buildup based off of that hook. That just leaves this nice like angelic tail at the end. Then we've got a vocal plate. This, I used a plate reverb because it's relatively short, and plates tend to give stuff like this lush feeling without pushing them too far back the way that like a room or a hall would. And this really helps glue all the layers together and just give it this, you know, reverby feel. But notice, it's not this gigantic lush reverb tail. It's more about putting the sound itself in that lush space, but not clogging up the mix. So it's only a 1.5 second reverb. I've EQ'd it a lot so that the lows don't get too muddy. The range of one of those ooh frequencies doesn't build up too much, and then I raise the highs a little bit. Then from there, we've just got EQ. This is just a lot of boosting. I think this was probably towards the end of everything when I was just doing those final enhancements to get it to poke out in the mix. And again, I'm using an EQ that's based off of analog gear because it's a lot easier to make good decisions. If you're presented with the whole Pro Q3 or the EQ8 and you can literally do anything, there's unlimited possibilities, you're more likely to look at the spectrum and feel and say, oh, there's a gap there, let me boost that, or oh, there's a resonant peak here, let me dip that. And suddenly you've got this like very flat sound. This, on the other hand, you kind of are forced to use your ears, and that way you're only doing things that sound good. Also, these EQs are really transparent, so you can make pretty big boosts and cuts without it feeling like it's been boosted or cut, whereas if you do that with EQ8, you're going to notice it really quickly. So using a nice EQ, also kind of undervalued, undertaught, but it's not a must-have, but it can make a really big difference, and it can force you to make better decisions because you're limited. And then we've got Soothe. Soothe is a great plugin for vocals, really good for de-essing, really good for managing resonant peaks. But notice I had already done a lot of this with ProQ beforehand, so that this is just managing like that last mile of problems that might occur. So for dips, for problem areas, ProQ is great, Soothe is great. For broader like tonal shaping, I would say these analog EQs are really nice. So I'll just play that with this. So it's getting louder, but it is getting a little bit brighter, more airy. And then last but not least, Track Spacer, another like one of my favorite plugins, really great for vocals. So what Track Spacer does is essentially sidechain something to something else so that it ducks, but only within a certain frequency band and only for the frequencies that are actually interfering. So I have this sidechain to the main verse. So that means when the main verse is playing, whatever frequencies in her voice in that verse, those will get ducked from the oohs. And this is better than a regular sidechain because if it's not interfering from a frequency perspective, it doesn't make a difference. And that way it feels natural, but it is still ducking. So I'll show you what that sounds like.
Now it's my turn to be happy.
So notice how the oohs seem to get louder after the verse phrase comes in, and then also quieter when it comes in.
Now it's my turn to be happy.
So really subtle. Again, if you overdo this, it quickly sounds unnatural.
Now it's my turn to be happy.
You can hear the pumping, you kind of lose the hook. So I have it super low ratio. You can see that it's like dipping. Yeah, so it's like already getting like minus 10 dBs-ish of gain reduction. So low ratios go a really long way. But I definitely recommend picking this one up if you haven't. It's just one of those like magic plugins that I'm sure people in the past wish they had and didn't. And if you don't hear about it from like experts, it's because they don't know it exists or it wasn't around when they learned how to do all this. But yeah, really good technology. Let's look at some questions. Yeah, I mean, so key is super important with the vocalists. There are times where a vocalist will tell me like this song doesn't really work in their range. Can we change the key? And I've tried that before. Doesn't always bring the best results. Sometimes I'll just find a different vocalist or give them a different instrumental. But yeah, I think a good vocalist will know their range and know what keys they're best in, but they should be able to ideally work in any key. That it just might be the top lines or the melodies will have to be different. So question about reverbs on insert or send. So with vocals, I kind of do both, though I like to lean towards returns because then the vocal doesn't get too washed out. For the oohs, it made sense to wash it out because it's kind of this overarching hook. But if we get into the main verse now, you can see I've got the same vocal plate reverb, but it's at 30% for most of the song instead of 50%. And this specific plate, this specific preset, happens to not really wash stuff out too much because it's a plate and just this specific one. If we listen to it with and without it.
Now it's my turn to be happy. Now it's my turn to be happy.
So it really stays front and center. This just helps give it a little bit of ambience. If you're using, a 3-second long hall verb on the insert of the vocal, it's going to immediately push it back in space. And I don't really like that. My theory or my philosophy with vocals is if you're going to have them, put them front and center. Don't be afraid if the song feels, more commercial, quote unquote, or like feels poppy or whatever. Like to me, if you're going to have vocals, you're trying to be more accessible. You're trying to make it a song that could work, to your friend who doesn't necessarily like electronic music, whatever. I'm not a fan of when there's vocals in a song, but they're super pushed back. It's like they might as well not even be there. Unless it's like a textural thing. I'm talking like lyrics verse, chorus, all that kind of stuff. So I like to put reverbs or like, be heavier on the auxes. Like you can see this one is sent at -2, so that's a lot of reverb coming. But because it's on the return channel, it's not going to push it back as far in the mix. It's not going to wash it out too much. This is the amazing vocal preset. Oops. One of my favorite presets for vintage verb, but notice, well, you won't notice, but I've changed the EQ settings on it as well, and I do that with all of my reverbs. Really, 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 really important to EQ your reverbs. And if you put them on an aux channel, it's easier to EQ them. If you're doing it here and you start EQing it, you're also affecting that dry signal. But if a lot of reverb presets start out with no EQ, and it's really important to cut some of that low end because it can build up really quickly and just muddy the mix. And you don't really notice it, but if you go into any of your projects after this and go to all of your reverbs and EQ all of them at like 150, 200, depending on the sound, maybe all the way up to 500, you'll notice this new clarity in the low mids that wasn't there before. And then similarly, if all your reverbs are hitting 20K and you bring them down to like 10 or maybe even to 6, or for vocals, maybe even to like 4, because you don't want those S's to send off into the reverb and get all this like messy hiss. So if you bring those high cuts down as well, you'll also notice suddenly your drums feel punchier. All the vocals feel like more direct, and that's because this wispy airiness isn't clogging up the high end of the mix. Someone's asking about comping too. That's a good question. So comping with vocals, it's useful to, if you have them in the room, to get a couple takes, not just for all this layering that I'm talking about, but for finding the actual best take. So Ableton even has a feature. I think I took out all the takes in this new version, but she definitely sent me more takes than I'm using right now. And I went through, listened to each little phrase, and maybe a C was too hard, or there was a click on her mouth, or she went like, or like some breathy thing, or maybe she said a word incorrectly, and then you can just cut and paste and replace the best parts of every take and use the best parts. That also kind of undertaught, but every song ever pretty much has comped the vocals. It's very rare that you would use an entire one take all the way through and it was perfect, and you don't want to replace even like one word here or there. So again, just one more argument for asking your vocalist to redo everything once or twice or 3 times, so you just have more to work with. Okay, so processing wise for the main one, it's pretty much the same, but just managing different things. So I was using a nicer compressor because with the main verse there's a lot more going on from like layering perspective, whereas the hook, it was all the same exact thing, super simple. With this, we've got a lot of doubles, a lot of octaves, these whispers, so I just kind of wanted to glue everything together and make sure nothing felt louder than anything else. Relatively fast attack, getting like 5 dBs of gain reduction at the most. When it comes to a lot of these compressors, like the nice analog modeled ones, they have really good presets. You just have to be careful that the level you're sending into them isn't affecting the preset negatively. So anytime you load a preset on anything, you should play around with how loud of a signal you're sending into it, whether that's the input knob or literally like this gain here, because plugins or presets are meant to be sent a certain level. Usually it's like -18-ish, but really depends on the company. But if I just loaded this preset and it was like this, it sounds really overcompressed. Even like the breaths, the ground floor noise, it's all really up front. And maybe it's because, my input levels just aren't right. But if I go back, now it's my turn to be happy, you can hear how much of a difference that makes. So you can't just use a preset without considering the level you're sending into it. So that's just really important with compression, especially. But other than that, this processing is very similar. A lot of the same like strategies. I did use a de-esser here, but I definitely went heavy with the Pro Q as well to manage all of that. And then the only other thing I'll mention outside of processing is manual clip automation. So let's try to find a good example. I think I did it on the ooze. So if there's breaths or clicks or hard consonants, whatever, a really good way to get rid of that without a plugin, and probably better than a plugin, is to actually just do a volume dip. So I just do that on clip modulation, where you go to clip, gain, and then you can literally dip whatever the problem area is. So in this case, she had those like diphthongs where her voice like sweeps up. I think that's what a diphthong is. And it was just kind of distracting because this was like a background hook, so I didn't want that sound, so I just dipped it. Like I could have used a compressor, I could have used a de-esser or whatever, but that's going to react to all the other things about the vocal. And if I know exactly where the problem is, I should just fix it as early on in the process as possible, which is on the clip itself. And that's another thing that kind of goes back to the idea of how people have been doing it for 50 years. There used to be the idea of like vocal riding. There still is, but you would literally hold the fader and move it up and down as the vocal is performed or as it's played back, trying to even it out yourself. And that's because compression is not as smart or doesn't have an ear the way you do. So yes, it's going to react to stuff and maybe it'll do a good job. And it's going to snap down on stuff that you didn't want it to snap down on. But this, you literally have full control. You can get as granular as you want. It's going to produce the cleanest result. And it's just going back to like this old practice of like manually fixing the problems with the vocal fader. You don't have to do it on everything. I'll usually listen back on my AirPods or something that really reveals the harshness and just make little timestamps of, okay, this consonant was really loud, this whatever sibilance was really bad, this breath was too loud, and then go back and fix it on the most offending channels, maybe on all of them. Sometimes you can even copy and paste this clip modulation to other ones if they're close duplicates or close doubles. But yeah, just going back to what I was saying before, like stop worrying about the processing, try to make the initial audio sound as good as possible, and then you won't need compressors, you won't need all these EQ dips, all these de-essers. It's a labor of love, but in my opinion, it's worth it. I'm super picky about vocals. And I hate hearing like a beautiful vocal that someone didn't take the time to take out these like harsh little bits. You don't want to overdo it either. Like breaths are natural. We hear them in music. So you're not getting rid of them. You're just trying to manage everything. And I think like once you're using all these plugins, the levels get so squashed that a breath that wasn't a problem before now is super loud. So you can bring it down here and then it won't be brought up in the compression. Hopefully I'm not getting like too detailed. If some of this is going over your head, don't feel discouraged. So yeah, this had some more de-essing, some Pro Q, less reverb, still some soothe. I guess one other thing I can talk about is the auto filter, because I have this on the ooze as well as the main verse. I felt like it was going to get tiring if I just had those ooh hooks the entire time, but I also wanted to have them in a lot so that it really gets stuck in your head. So I just introduced them a bit more filtered down at the beginning of the second verse. So that compared to this. So all that air is gone. And if there's one thing you can do to push something back in the mix, it's getting rid of the high frequencies. We all know from like festivals, sub travels the farthest. You know, you hear that bass before you hear anything else. So if you high cut something, you're effectively pushing it back in the mix because it's going to feel more distant. So I basically use that strategy or that dynamic to make it feel like the oohs were getting closer and closer throughout the verses. And similarly, at the beginning of the song, I have it really low cut or high cut so that it is almost like a ghost of itself. really subtle. It's also quieter. But if I didn't have that, yeah, one is right in your face, the other is very distant. And because I was only teasing the idea, I wanted it to be more distant. Someone's asking about how I'm like soloing and not soloing when I am doing this processing. So it's a good question. I think I'm trying to do it in the mix as much as possible. For sibilants and breaths and stuff, once I know it's a problem in the context of the whole mix, I'll solo it so that I can more easily make sure I'm clipping exactly what needs to be clipped and nothing else. Because if you do it too much, it'll sound like they have a lisp or that they like missed a click in their mouth. So if I'm doing, I try to find the problems, discover the problems in the context of the whole mix, because that's all that matters. If it sounds shitty as soloed but fine in the mix, then you don't worry about it because no one's listening to it soloed. But once I find the problems, I'll solo it to try to treat them as accurately as possible and then check it again in the context of the whole mix. Okay, cool. So then the doubles, just some tuning. I like to get rid of either low or high frequencies on a lot of these doubles because say there's a really sibilant part that's like an S or a T or whatever, a consonant part. If I have 7 layers and they all have that word in it, rather than try to correct every single layer, I'll try to fix or like remedy the main one and then just do high shelves or low shelves or high cuts, low cuts on the rest because I might not be needing them for their extra frequencies or their extra body. It's more to get that the feeling of it being layered. So I sometimes just do a broad stroke and just bring the highs of all these doubles down so that those S's and T's aren't as offensive. And I'm still getting what I need from the double. But it's not like drastic cuts. I think shelves are a lot safer. I'm trying to think if there's anything else from a processing perspective. There's this echo. This is a useful trick. So for vocal echoes and delays, I think a big thing of getting clarity out of it is making sure you're only delaying the part of it that you want delayed. So if you, there's exceptions, but if you just have Echo Boy or whatever echo on the channel itself, you're going to just be getting this flat echo across the board of every word, every sound, and it's going to just be ongoing throughout the entire mix. I can kind of simulate that here. And maybe turn it up just so it's obvious. So we get the ha, we get the p, we get the my turn. So notice while she's in the middle of singing, we're already hearing all those delay tails bouncing back and forth. It can quickly build up in the mix and just start to clog up and you lose clarity of the main lyrics. So what I've done is dipped how much I'm sending to the echo, and then I bring it up towards the end of the phrase so that it's mostly just the be happy that gets echoed, but not all this part in the beginning. You can also sidechain your echoes. So I've sidechained this echo to the main verse so that it ducks when the verse is there. So that's even further preventing it from overlapping itself while she's still singing.
Now it's my turn to be happy.
So we're getting like 8 dBs of reduction. And I have a slower attack, slower release so that you don't notice that it's like pumping up and down as much. Some echoes have ducking built in. If you see ducking or gating, that's what this is about. But the safest way is just, send what you want to send. A lot of times, if you really listen closely to pop music, you'll notice like only the last word is delayed. And that's like the natural thing that we're used to hearing. And that's kind of what they're doing usually is riding that fader so that it just delays the last bits. The only other reverbs on the first verse, I've got Black Hole. I think this part is just a lot emptier in the song, so I wanted something to kind of create ambience, and I felt it would be better if it was built off of the vocal. So I sent it to Black Hole, but as you could hear, is super quiet. Just enough to kind of fill in some gaps.
Time to let go of the past.
And this black hole is just really good for like ethereal little bits. Also, if you're putting reverb or echo or anything on a return, just make sure it's 100% wet. Otherwise, you're just going to be doubling the signal as you send it, which is going to give it this additional loudness that you don't necessarily want. The octaves, I also kind of drenched a little bit more in reverb intentionally because I'm really just using the octaves to get this higher frequency energy and this like nicer angelic texture. But it's not supposed to be the focus, right? The main vocal's the focus. So I could afford to get a wetter reverb on it. Still relatively short though. And then I don't have any widening plugins on here because I had so many doubles allowing me to do that. But sometimes micro shift can be helpful from Sound Toys. That's like 30 to 50% wet. You never want to just push any of these things too hard, and then you'll avoid problems. But yeah, altogether.
Now it's my turn to be happy.
Anything else? Yeah, I guess so. Track Spacer, Sue, these are all like very useful plugins. You don't need them. I'd say if you're like really on the advanced level, it's something worth exploring. Maybe get it on Black Friday. But the idea of like controlling resonances, controlling levels, and then Track Spacer helps kind of duck certain things for the main vocal, and that's how I was able to stack so much and also have the hook going during some of these vocal parts without it getting too clogged up. Yeah, I think that's enough with the vocal. It's already been an hour. I got so many questions beforehand about the vocal that I just thought it was worth spending a lot of time. You don't really get as much attention to this usually. But yeah, let me head to all this chord stuff that's going on, and then we can hit the drums. So the chords, it's a lot of different patches. I'll just play each of them. So that was the main one. Then behind it, there was this softer one. Kind of a little more like whimsical. They're doing two different things. This one's giving fullness and brightness. This one is helping reinforce every note that's hit because it has a sharper attack. And it also gives it a more like unison, phasey, like, yeah, I guess just like a kind of a phasing vibe where it's just a little bit more character than your classic super saw. So 2 layers, very different sounding. That's why they're working together. I also later in the process introduced these extra stabs. Same patch as these chords, but I brought the envelopes down so that it was just the attack of the sound pretty much. And that was so that as the chords changed notes, it was just reinforcing those note changes, because otherwise it's like a little too jazzy if you just kind of hear it all together. But those leading notes between each addition of the chord, as I build the chord, really help turn it into a hook. Otherwise it's just like this big blast of chord. And that's especially useful at the beginning, where you hear each pluck. Without that, and then with it again. So you can hear how it was a little too soft, and I wanted each note to be really defined because I was turning it into a hook. You know, it wasn't just, hey, look at this huge chord. It was, watch me build it up note by note in a way that feels kind of hooky. this one has no processing because it's all here, but it's mostly just saturation and EQ, trying to give it a lot more energy and harmonics. I also have tremolator on it, and I automate this to just give it a little bit more character. So you can see here is like the first time it's really obvious where that LFO. So that's all tremolator. It's unsynced, and I'm automating the depth, so the amount, plus the tempo, which is basically just the rate of that tremolo, and it's getting slower and slower. And then I also have the width automated a little bit, which is just making the left and right sides rotate at different start points so that it feels super wide. So just over time, it's getting more intense, slower, and wider. But without that, it's just kind of a generic chord thing. So it's just helping it give a little more personality. Similarly, during the breakdown, I do that. And throughout the track, when it's just holding that main chord, it's totally synced. So I automated it to be on beat. And then this is just giving a little bit of pump. So it's like 16th notes in addition to the sidechain, which is just a nice little like rhythmic thing. And then I use it again here. Where it just kind of helps fade it out a little bit. But I think it was mostly this first section where I really use the tremoler. I also have this plugin, one of my favorite plugins. It just adds white noise to anything, but you can customize the white noise as well as filter it, change the attack and release and the stereo. But I just use this to add noise to the whole chord group so that for transitions, rather than have a white noise sweep, it's coming from those chords and it just feels a little bit more glued into the song. So you can hear with it and without it. Similarly here. All that white noise hiss is from this plugin. You could add it on the synth itself, but a lot of times it's really like low, mid, heavy, and I didn't want to have to like deal with EQing it. The other layers of this gigantic chord thing, I've got a choir that comes in slowly, so it's fading in. So super subtle, but I think a lot of the ideas with layering is that you don't necessarily need to hear certain layers the entire time. But I find that like right around here when the chords switch, you kind of hear a couple like low ohs, and those like really tie the whole thing together and give it like this extra injection of emotion. Like right there. So I thought that was a cool touch. That kind of happens because I hold out some of these notes past where the next chord begins. And then the last, I have this Juno chord drone thing. This is a contact library. I think this is the Olafur Arnolds one. Yeah. This also slowly filtering it up, slowly fading it in. I'm cutting out a lot of the low mids because that's coming from these other layers, so I don't need it. This is just to add a little bit more like thickness and richness to it all. It also offsets the choir, which is on the right side. And this is on the left. So let's just add it up one at a time from the quietest to the loudest. And then last but not least, that piano I mentioned before, that comes in towards the end of the breakdown just to further accentuate the note changes. So there's obviously like 2 layers are doing most of the work. The rest are just supporting. But layering isn't always just about like the one moment that all of them are together. It's also, now that I made all these layers, I have 5 different sounds that I can use to tease the same idea. So I do that with the piano. The drone from the Juno just kind of hovers over everything during the verses. And here it's a lot more noticeable. When it goes away, at least. Here. It just kind of fills in that mid-range. These main chords do something similar. And same with the pads. So, like here, for example, at the beginning, I don't even use the main fizzy chords, the saw wave chords, in that first tease, just the second layer, which helps keep it soft. It doesn't give the whole idea away, but it does reinforce it with a sound that, you know, we're going to continue hearing throughout. And then similarly with the choir, I add that in a little bit here, but also super quiet. I also took the mastering chain off, so everything is going to be a little less squash, so you might think, oh, well, you can barely hear the choir. Mastering would have really brought that up a lot more, but I didn't want the CPU to mess with the streaming. So it's not as subtle as it might seem. Processing wise, a lot of it is just with the initial sound. So I built sounds that sounded good before having to like do all this extra processing, but it's mostly just saturation, maybe some reverb, like there's Black Hole on this one. Pro Q definitely was important in managing a lot of the different resonant peaks when those notes are getting held, but still everything had a pretty light touch across the board. And then on the main one, this just kind of manages everything. So like once I have all those layers and they're all processed a little bit, whatever, I like them, they sound good, I want to do some group processing, which helps glue it together, make sure once all the layers are summed up, it's not getting too loud or too resonant at a certain area. So there's some dips here. There's Soothe doing some work, just helping manage that. Compressor, this was helping just manage the brightness. So I use this multi-band compressor from Isotope because it's really easy to visually see what's happening. But I think just towards the end of the breakdown, it just got a little too bright. So this is just helping clamp down on that. And that's something that should be done at the group level because it only matters once everything is summed up how it's sounding in the mix. You know, is it too bright now that I've added all these layers? Can I manage that with compression? Or in this case, this is a really nice EQ that just is very transparent and just helps clear out some mud without noticing that you're like really cutting. But again, it's not doing that much, just managing some of the low mid from like 1 to 500. And this is all, this is not stuff it's like, oh, when you do a big chord stab, do what Enamour did right now. Like this is all reactionary from how it was sounding in the mix. You know, I noticed, okay, the lows are building up too much, or it felt muddy on a couple systems, like maybe I can trim it down just a tiny bit. But yeah, really light touch, not overdoing EQs, not pushing anything too hard. And then from an arrangement standpoint, it's mostly just a lot of held notes for the verses and then the really big breakdown here. The Sunrise dub version of this was the original instrumental version, and there's another chord thing in the beginning breakdown, but it's all pretty similar stuff. And then I also have track spacer here, which is track spacing to the entire vocal bus, just so at no point do the vocals fall too far behind the chords. But again, really light touch. It's, you know, pretty low percentage. Not doing that much, just enough to make it, you know, the idea is like all your processing you should notice a difference when you mute all of it, but it shouldn't be very drastic. You want everything to feel like, natural, it's working together, not these gigantic pumps when, something else comes in, especially with side chaining. I don't know if you guys have questions about the chords. Like, I can talk more about the sound design, but it's all pretty straightforward. It's like big super saws. Unison is a good technique to get bigger chords. Chorus as well. And then the key is just finding the sweet spot between the filter settings and the envelope settings. But that's a pretty standard sound. I think a good amount of it might be, the EQ and saturation. This Omega is just one of my favorite plugins from Kush. They have 4 of these transformers. Just really good saturation. It adds a ton of body. It adds a lot of loudness without changing the peaks. It's just kind of one of those like secret, magical, awesome plugins. Decapitator is also really good. But yeah, this helped add a lot of like low warmth to the sound. A lot of that's coming from this EQ as well, and then dipping a little bit as well. But yeah, a lot of these settings, I would hope you guys aren't super focused on the settings of these plugins. It's more about finding a plugin you're comfortable with, using your ears, getting it to sound good in the mix. Let's see. So let's talk about the drop a little bit. So how do we get this relatively like minimal idea to sound good in this big drop? And it's by adding a couple extra like bonus elements. So this drone is one. These strings. So this helps kind of raise that final section. A high string is always a good technique for that. This comes in a lot hotter than it had in the past, in the previous versions. So really soft, but here it's almost acting as like this driving force with this pad as well. And then that combined with all of the drones, you get like this big blast of high frequency synth, which helps a lot. So if we just mute all those, so let's just listen to both. This is with everything. But if we were to mute that and the chord, it doesn't have that lift. It's not the same lift that it had with all the other ones. And it also has this farfisa, which is that glassy thing. That's doing a lot of work too. So if we were to mute that, you really just get the bass growl. And it just kind of falls flat. So rather than have a big white noise burst or a big, whatever, splashy impact, I'm just going with like higher frequency drones, something that's more angelic and like lush to match the vibe of the song. So those elements all combined really help with that. It also has this little syncopated pluck sound. And it's the first time we hear it, and this was just to give it a little bit of forward moving energy. Potentially could have been overkill, but it helps drive the song. It also kind of blends in with the ARP so that it doesn't feel like it's coming out of nowhere. It just feels like a more rhythmic, energetic version of the ARP. But yeah, like end of the day, maybe it could have done without it. I don't think it's hurting the song though. And then the big thing that also helps the drop is that I automate the bass a lot higher frequency for the first time, really. There's the occasional like sweep like that, but it comes in really hot, really energetic in the mids, as well as the other layers. And then this one also is doing a lot of the work there. So these other bass layers beforehand, very low in the mix. This one's more about the initial hit and then kind of fades out. This one's more sustained. And then we got the main bass. So really important to notice the difference here. Like the reason the drop works, the reason there's more energy is hanging really heavily on this bass automation. The fact that it's so much growlier and that this layer is unfiltered really sends it to that next level. So when you are wondering why your drop's not hitting hard enough, rather than adding some stuff, especially white noise, splash, think about like, can my existing elements be kind of leveled up a little bit? Can I raise the filter up or the cutoff up? Can I add, this higher drone? And I think a lot of times that works better than special effects and gives you like a less cheesy result. Before getting the bass, let's just cover some of the other musical parts though. Actually, we're already in the bass. Let's just cover it. So the main one is a wavetable patch. Saw wave with a little bit of unison. Let's get rid of this. So already a strong patch before the processing. That's important. It's got a good sub layer. It's got a good mid-range layer. I honestly don't love the bass in this song. I was going back and forth with different ideas, but I do think it works pretty well. But let's see what we got here. If you guys use Span, this is a free plugin, the best spectrometer in my opinion, and it has this preset called low frequency inspection where you can see the harmonics of your bass. So I can see you've got this low sub layer, an octave above that, the harmonic because it's a saw wave, and then the third octave. And that's why it's so full. If your bass isn't sounding full or it's just sounding weak or not warm enough, consider how many oscillators are in it and like how many octaves you're using. So this has, the main octave, then the sub is an octave below it, which gives it that girth. Whereas without it, kind of sounds thin. This one might be more noticeable. Yeah, so a lot warmer. And then I've got the second oscillator does a fifth kind of power chord thing. This is like what like Deadmau5 famously like popularized. But by having this separate oscillator on the fifth harmonic, so 7 semitones up, it kind of gives it that power chord vibe versus a regular octave. So we're almost hearing a chord, so to speak, in the bass line. And a lot of presets, you'll hear that's like how they get the sound that they get. Like that growly bass often has this fifth harmonic built in rather than from the sound, the wave itself, though the saw wave's helping with that. The only thing is you have to understand what that does to the song melodically. So when I had this breakdown bass to match the chords, I had to change that back to the octave or to zero rather than the fifth because it sounded weird when I was doing that chord, that like mini 2-note chord over something that already had all this harmonic content, the main chords. Hopefully that makes sense. But essentially it's like if your bass is going to kind of have a chord vibe where it's almost 2 notes rather than 1, that might melodically make things difficult if your musical parts are more complex, because now it's like you're trying to layer a low chord with a higher chord above it. So I had to automate that down just for this little section. That's also why a lot of these power chord songs all sound the same, because not every note sounds good with the fifth on it, just because some of those notes will potentially be out of the scale. From a layering point or from a processing point of view, just some saturation gives it some growl. EQ not really doing much. Decapitator doing a good amount. Compression, trying to manage that peak a little bit and make sure it's just more even throughout. Dipping a little bit in the low mids. Bringing it in a little bit. It felt too wide for a while, and then these layers were going to give it the width, so I thought that bringing it in to 50% as well as monoing under 175 was reasonable, so that it doesn't float around too much. And then we have this. So rather than use a return, I think I ran out. I just did an audio effect rack. So this is, if you don't know about this technique, really useful. You can just right click. Well, you group it first. So Command G, then you can right click, create chain, and that just creates an empty chain. So I do that, call it dry, and then this is effectively doing nothing. It's just sending it through dry. But you can create another chain and then do whatever you want to it. So here I have a delay. We're treating it like a return because it's basically just a duplicate of it. So it's got to be 100% wet. Really subtle ping pong delay. Narrowed in a little bit because we don't need it to be fully wide. I think that's a big problem, is when too many things in your track are fully like 100% wide, you kind of lose the focus. So I like to pick certain things that can be all the way wide, and then other things I try to narrow it in a little bit. And with ping pong delays especially, I like to narrow it in. And then I have some reverb on that delay, so it's just a bit farther back. And then together. So it just gives it this tiny little bit of width. When the notes do the faster change, it's interesting. And that just gives it a little more space, a little more character. This layer, this is from like an old patch that I used on all the songs that you hear that like growly bass. I would go through the sound design with this one, but I've done it like 10 times. It's on YouTube already on my remix of Above and Beyond tutorial. It's also all over my Patreon. But essentially it's just a lot of saturation and distortion and finding like a sweet spot with the filter. And this is spread a little bit so it's wide combined with this, and that's kind of giving us a little bit more width for the bass. This is also, I think, the patch I used from Ruby and my remix of Camilo San Clemente from a long time ago. But this is just, you know, more saw wave, power chord, growl, similar to that first patch. Notice I'm still filtering it in a good amount because there's so much other stuff going on in the song. I didn't really want this to take center stage, but I did just want it to subtly be like supporting the energy. But again, notice they're all three are doing different things. This one's more sustained. It's very much about adding some growl to the initial hit, and then this is the main one. Pretty similar to that one, just kind of supporting it. And then side chaining. This one is ducked by itself just to give it a tiny bit more pump, but they're all sidechain on the group. The first one is for the kick, which is just the transient of the kick, or just the punch of the kick because of this EQ. So really quick, short dips. And I encourage you guys to use the Ableton compressor on this mode right here, so you can actually visualize like what's going on with your sidechain, because sometimes you might not realize your release and your attack are totally screwing up the track, and then you go here and you're like, oh, no wonder. It's like not even making it back before it can sidechain again. So this is just giving an initial dip for the kick so that it can punch through a little bit. And then I've also got a track spacer high cut so that it's only dipping this part of the low frequencies of the bass. And that just lets the sub of the kick come through just a little bit more. Again, all of these things are light touches, you know, it's the sum of this which makes it audible. If you can hear the pumping, you've already gone too far, in my opinion, unless you're making like old school trance. Then there's also this tom loop. It's pretty busy. And I've got the bass track space to this as well, but again, only 200 or 300 hertz and below. So that mid-range growl of the bass goes through no matter what, untouched. And that kind of helps it not feel like it's pumping, and it just gives it that driving feel. But if you pay attention, you'll hear the toms are poking through a lot more. And then without the track spacer. That one's really noticeable. You can hear like it starts to overlap with the notes of the bass in a way that isn't harmonious. Still subtle, but I can really hear like the second time it was really cutting through a lot more. So track spacer can be really useful for managing toms and a bass line at the same time. So all together. So you don't notice the bass is ducking because it's only those sub frequencies that are ducking because of track spacer. And the second they duck, they're being filled with something else. So the sub is staying pretty constant, but the grooves are going in and out. Whereas the top mid-range of the bass goes untouched, which makes it feel like there isn't actually this obvious sidechain when in fact in the low end there is. So for all those people asking about bass, tom, kick, how do you do it? Track spacer helps a lot. Before track spacer, before I knew about it, I was using sidechain and EQ dips, but I find this works a lot better. Let's see if there's any questions. Cool. Doesn't look like there's any questions about this stuff. Someone asked about automation and that it seems like I do it a lot. Yes, I do. A lot of times I record it in by hand. A lot of times I just get super granular and like technical with the mouse. But I think a big part of this song is that the bass is evolving over time. You know, I mentioned that big macro change in the second drop. That's obviously super important. But I should mention all these like little micro changes that give the bass so much more personality. They help lead into different sounds. The whole thing is just very congruous. So like notice these little sweeps. Just that tiny little wow wow is like enough to just help you move forward in the track, or like this one too. Versus without it. Subtle, but you can kind of hear it like sweep into that little section, or this one might be a better one. Or this one. So those little micro changes can help introduce these little elements to just help give it some variation. But the patch itself also has something cool on it. So the LFO that's attached to the filter is delayed. So in Wavetable, it's called attack. On other synths, it's called delay. But if you ever see attack or delay on an LFO, that just means like how long do you want it to fade in until it's at its full height and or amplitude. And this, if you paid attention, you already heard it, but the bass starts off solid and then it slowly goes wow 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 wow, and the LFO kind of adjusts the filter and it gives it this this rhythm that helps like lock you back into the bass line. So you can see it and you could hear it there. So I think some of those micro changes that I had were nice, but I think a lot of it was also just coming from this modulation that I programmed in. that same LFO is also affecting the wave folding, which gives it that growly sound because it's kind of saturating. It's effectively making a similar sound as if you were to saturate or to distort it. But the fact that it's happening over time and it's growing makes you notice it. If it was happening the whole time, your brain would just kind of forget that it's happening and it would just become the standard thing. But the way it ebbs and flows into that LFO really gives it some character. It also makes sure that the stab at the beginning isn't affected or isn't changed by that LFO. So if the attack wasn't there, right away that pumping happens and you kind of lose the impact. But with it, you get the whole sound and then it sweeps up. So you could definitely experiment with attacks and delays on LFOs to get these cool, like, growing effects with whatever you're modulating with them. Let's see. I'm also going to mention now, rather than at the end, that if you are learning a lot right now, I've done this exact same like 2-hour thing with like a dozen of my songs on my Patreon. So if this content is helpful for you, please check out my Patreon. I would love to help more of you. And there's this tier, that's the producer 2 tier, that still has spots open. The other ones are sold out now as of yesterday. But it gives you access to all the content, the producer 2 tier. So if this was helpful, definitely check it out. There's also like tons of other videos on it, like 5-minute ones, 10-minute ones, whatever, just covering a bunch of random stuff. Highly would recommend if you like this teaching style of me just kind of going through everything. Okay, cool. Let's see. So from a music standpoint, there's these farfisas that I just mentioned, or I mentioned earlier. So notice the delay tails change speed. That's another interesting, unique way to get variation from a sound when you can't change the sound design. This beast of a thing, it's like kind of like an early sampler in a way. Like it's like an organ, but it could play like a trumpet sound, a string sound, whatever. So it's similar to like that, but you can't really change like a ton of settings on it. So I was thinking, how can I keep it fresh, because I'm just playing it on the downbeat over and over again. And to me, the way to do that was modulate the echo. So I just change it from a faster echo to a dotted eighth. And that helps ground it to the song, and it just helps you latch onto it a little more. But it's also still super subtle. The faster one kind of gets a little blurry, so it's almost as if every other one has this really strong dotted eighth that fits the groove, and then the alternative one is just kind of like a quick like fade out in a way, because it's such a faster delay. But yeah, just something to think about. Don't be afraid to, like, I do this with vocals too. Like if I'm repeating one loop over and over again, like one word, maybe it's cool to do an dotted eighth delay and then an eighth delay every other time. So it's the same word over and over again, but it doesn't get stale because it's alternating between those two delay times. God, is there a way to boot this bot that keeps trying to put an adult dating site in the chat room? Where are the mods at? The other stuff that's going on with the farfisa is just echo, delay, compression. We've got this ARP. This was a fun one. So this, as you can see, I had, because it was a random ARP, and a lot of delay, a lot of modulation. I messed with this it was an audio temp preset that I just continued to like mess with until it just got weirder, more random. And then I just held these long chords and bounced it, so I would get this long random sequence, and then I picked the best parts of it, mix and matched until I got like a 16-bar phrase or so, and then copied some of the similar ones to pop up in different places so that it kind of felt familiar, and then other places I kind of left at random. But this was just comping a ton of takes until I got something that I liked, and then just, either copy pasting it or continue to comp it. And this is mostly just for like texture, rhythm, interest, but because it's random, it's pretty far back in the mix. The other cool thing, so if I take this processing off, we've got, you can hear there's a lot of low and high frequencies we don't really want. So I delayed it to get every sound to like keep, lasting longer. And then a bandpass filter and a notch filter that have pretty high LFOs on them. So it's as if these are just constantly moving left and right. And that just makes it so it's making some parts a little bit quieter, more silent because it's filtering stuff out, and other parts, a little squelchier and more noticeable. And that helps keep it, it keeps it, like, manages it a little bit from like a frequency perspective. And then I've also got this primal tap on here. Where is primal tap? Yeah. And this is giving it a lot of those pitch effects. So like right there. Yeah, so this is just helping those delay tails change in pitch. It's super subtle ear candy stuff, and I just made one pattern and then pasted it all the way. But yeah, this is more of like an ear candy thing to just have cool delay tails that are synced as they pitch up and down, because that's what primal tap does. Oh yeah, but I'm also automating the output gain, so they're pretty quiet at this section, but they get louder at some other point. Yeah, like this macro. So like right here, they'd be pretty loud. Yeah, this is so subtle, honestly. I think this is when the ARP was a bigger part of the song, and then I pushed it back so far that it doesn't even matter. Then just some compression limiting to help any of these stray peaks or clicks. It just helps block those out. Because again, it's a background element, so we don't need everything to like push out so far. And then this is just a bunch of kids playing in a playground that I have throughout the mix. This was just a reverb tail from these piano chords that I resampled the reverb, reversed it, and then threw it into a delay, so we get this cool tail. Resampling reverbs is a great way to get ambience that matches your song. And it's always sweeping into something, usually. Maybe it's sweeping into the farfisa or to just a 16-bar loop or something. And that just helps the forward motion of the song. It just helps keep you getting dragged forward in the arrangement because they're sweeping forward. Let's see. Seems like that's all of the musical parts. I also bounced the reverb of the farfisa to get this little atmosphere. And then I just looped a little bit, so it just kept going. So I've got this like pumping ghost of the farfisa, so that way when it comes in for the first time, it doesn't sound totally foreign, because it's acting as a drone for half the song, and then it finally sweeps into the first time that you hear it. So it helps just lock that down a little bit more. So I think that's all the musical stuff. There's probably, I think that's actually all of it. And we've covered the bass. So the last thing we have is drums. Drums on this one, not super interesting. It's a lot of layering loops. I don't think I was super inspired on the drums. I got so attached to like the chord. That was the first thing that I started when I wrote the song. I was like, let me just do this epic chord build up and see what happens. And then I just quickly threw some drums together, and then over time changed or processed them. But it was definitely a lot of like trying to quickly get a couple loops that sounded good so that I could keep moving on the idea without getting distracted. Really simple top loop. This I think is a Foley loop that, yeah, I think I like cut some parts out and then pasted them in a different pattern. Shaker. Little wood block thingies. The clap. The real drums. This is from a Contact library, as well as a loop of real drums. So notice I am copy and pasting the fills. Sometimes I copy like this full fill. Other times I copy a part of it or change the start point so that it's a different fill, but it's still all the same sounds. And I mix that up so that it's not always the same fill every time. I also like progressively add more drums throughout the song, like this open hat grows and gets a little longer. This 80s CMI thing helps kind of give it the old school vibe. This was bounced from a Contact library, I think. I didn't need that hi-hat or even really the snare. It was more like that the little clave. So that's EQ'd out. More shakers that come in halfway through. They're double tracked, so they have different start points. So effectively, they're two different recordings, you know, and left and right help give the whole song or the whole drum group that width. And that comes halfway through the first main section. So it's kind of with the clave here, it's kind of adding that extra energy and like helping push the song forward with the farfisa. So I'm introducing a bunch at once that like helps stay interesting and helps move you to the next section. Yeah, so shakers and the farfisa at the same time. Then we've got this noise perk. This is also that Denise Audio plugin. Just kind of polyrhythmic white noise sample. Also helps push the song forward because it's a polyrhythm, so it's da 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 da. The whole thing is just one bar, but like this aspect of it is kind of polymeter-ish, like rather than be something like more rigid on the grid. I guess it's really syncopated. I shouldn't have said polyrhythmic. I think it was at some point, and I actually changed it back. So this is kind of used as the transitional thing because over time it gets brighter and brighter. And the release gets longer, the fall gets longer. I like using a Denise. You could do this on a sampler as well or a white noise oscillator synth, but I have an LFO controlling the fall, which is the release. So that's what's giving it slight variations every hit rather than it being totally static. That slight variation just makes it feel a little bit more like real and like a actual percussion element. And then at the drop I add just rise on the downbeat or the upbeat. So a good upbeat ride really can help a final climax feel more energetic. Just helps add that noise, that excitement. It's almost like using white noise, but in a way that feels more connected to the drums. The processing on all of this isn't, I mean, you could learn a good amount, but it's all like very specific to these drums. I've also covered my drum processing in so many videos, the free ones on my YouTube as well as every Patreon video, but essentially it's just using saturation, a little bit of compression, transient designing. Parallel distortion is like a big thing, that I do. So I've got this whole bus through Adopter, which is a really good distortion plugin. That's just really crushing everything. And then I have it mixed super quiet. This is not the best example because these drums are kind of light. I didn't want them to be too tough, but you can still hear how it's making a little bit of a difference. It's usually more noticeable when there's less going on. Yeah, so you can notice it just adds like body, girth, and thickness to everything. A little parallel compression. This is just to help the kick stand out. Oops. Not doing too much. I'm not sure if anyone has questions about the drums. Hopefully just me showing you all the layers is useful. We don't really have time to go through all the processing. So someone's asking about how do you determine what is too bright and what's too dull. I think referencing is your best friend in this situation because you can't necessarily trust your ears 100% if your headphones aren't, flat or if they're just bad headphones generally, or if your monitors aren't, tuned properly for the room, or your room is really small and you get all these reflections. There's so much that could go wrong from a listening side of it that you really have to have some reference point to understand how something sounds in your room. So I think comparing your song to other songs and trying to normalize the volume, so you have to bring that mastered version of the reference track down. You can use your ears as well as, maybe a spectrum thing like Span to see where the brightness levels are and hear how bright something sounds and then compare it to your track. I think that's the best way. And then once you know what sounds too bright, what sounds too dull in your room, you don't necessarily need to rely on the references as much. But even at the professional level, references are always super useful. Also, your ears can just get so tired so quickly that you don't hear bright sounds for as bright as they are. And that's also where a reference can come in handy because it might sound fine to you because your ears are so tired. And then you put it up to a reference and notice, okay, it's like 10 dBs too bright or whatever. So as far as the drums for side chaining, I don't always do this, but for this song, it kind of made sense. I did a slight pump on all of the drums to the kick, but really not much at all. Some of the shakers are side chained to the upbeat hat so that it can poke out a little bit more. Some of the real drum channels that have that fake kick, that could be sidechained to the kick or to the bass even, just so that at no point will that low frequency stuff get in the way of what's happening in the song. It's pretty well EQ'd, but I couldn't EQ more of it out without hitting into the snare territory. I think it was this one. Yeah. But it's also on the downbeat, so it doesn't really hurt the song. If it was like a breakbeat loop that was in the middle of the phrase, maybe I would have dealt with it more. The tom is also sidechained to the kick. This is a couple different samples, all tuned so that there's like a melody within the tom loop. It's really important to tune your toms, tune all of your drums, If something doesn't sound right, try just transposing it 50 cents or one semitone in either direction, and sometimes it'll fit 10 times better in a mix, just like slightly tuned in a different way. The toms, though, I needed to match with the bass line so that it would still feel like a progression rather than just some random sound. But yeah, you can hear it's like kind of a little mini melody, how it's going down and back up. And that is a couple different samples that I've transposed to be in the right key, but then also duplicating some samples and just transposing them. How do you tame the low end on a kick, 80 hertz and under? You don't. I have a strong opinion on EQing kicks, EQing the low end on kicks. I would say don't do it because it's very likely that you're going to make it worse than it is and you won't even know. So unless you're in a professional studio, unless you can hear what you're doing below 50, 60 hertz, don't touch it. Just have faith that the samples you're using are good. And if not, get better samples. But it's so hard to monitor what's going on below 60 hertz in a room that's untreated or on monitors that don't even go down that far, or especially on headphones, that it's just my theory with all of this, my philosophy with all of this is try to set yourself up to make as few mistakes as possible and to make as good decisions as possible. So to me, that means don't deal with your kick. Just try to find a better sample if you can until you're really experienced, you know what you're doing, you know, you're releasing music at like a pro level, whatever, then you probably can hear the difference. Also, kicks for this style of music should go all the way down to like 40 hertz, in my opinion. 50, 60, definitely. 80 is way too high unless you're making like minimal house or like something where the bass line is way more prominent. But here in like progressive melodic techno, the kick is king, and it should definitely be deep and, you know, have a lot of low end to it. Tuning the toms. Yeah, you tune them by ear, but you can also use a tuner. They usually pick up a tom. You can also in span, like I mentioned before, go to this low frequency inspection mode, and this is a free plugin. And then you can actually see, okay, this is F sharp. This one is and you can press hold too to make it easier. So C sharp, F sharp. So you can tune that way as well. And you can also drag this to zoom in even further if you really are having trouble. But that's why I love span so much, because of this low frequency inspection mode. Do I use a sub in my studio? No. So my speakers go down to 35 hertz. So that is enough for me. I also have a sub pack, which I use always. Highly recommend. They're super back ordered right now, but might be able to find an old one used. Let's see what else. Let me know if you guys have any other questions. Otherwise, we'll probably end shortly. Yeah, I guess also just bus processing. All of the vocals were sent to a bus. All of the music was sent to a different bus, and I have processing on that too. Just mostly like either a little bit of saturation. Tape is really good, tape saturation, to help give stuff a lot more brightness and just clarity, I think. Also shaves the transients, but let me just show you what all of this might be doing for the vocals.
Now it's my turn to be happy.
So it's doing a lot, probably more than it should be. I'm adding a lot of volume, but this is always the last part of the process. So everything's mixed, ready to go. I bust them and then do like the final enhancements. And then, you know, weeks, months later, go back, listen again. And I try to shape stuff in these groups just because it's a lot faster and it's kind of like that last touch. But this, I would say, is probably doing more than it should be doing on a bus because it's so much louder. But that was probably just because I was adding the vocals after the instrumental was fully complete. So I had to kind of work with something that had already been mixed, and I had already like mastered it, tested it out, etc. Music bus hopefully is a little different. Yeah, I think it's this console, I guess. Yeah, I must have just wasn't paying attention and just drove this a lot. Yeah, it's not a good habit though. I usually do not do that. Yeah, so just one note on the kick. Someone's asking about if I am doing any other processing. So I do have an EQ on it. This UAD Harrison EQ is really nice for kicks. It does have this low cut, but it's at like 20 hertz, and it just gives it this really nice body. You don't really notice it here that much. At least on my headphones I don't, but I know it's doing something. So I am EQing here, but trying to leave the low end mostly alone, and then I send it to a parallel compression bus, which just gives it extra click because I have the lows filtered out. And this just helps kind of add a little bit extra click to the kick above everything else because it's on a return. So you can hear how that makes it a little bit more forward. It's mixed in quietly at -15, but it's just enough to make a difference. This Fairchild 670, also UAD, not really doing anything. It's just one of those plugins because it's based on analog gear that if you put it on, it just immediately brings everything forward, even with this no gain reduction and no output. Just kind of gives everything a tiny bit more punch. And these are just tools that I've kind of picked up over the years, plugins I picked up over the years. Other than that, the kick is going through straight to the master, yeah. Do I have any standard bus vocal processing? Not really. I have tools that I reuse over and over again. Like I love Studer on all my buses. I love this Fresh Air plugin at low doses. This is a lot higher than I would normally do. But again, I was adding the vocals after everything was mixed, so that's probably why. Fresh Air is also free. Soothe I always use. This EQ is one of my favorite EQs for vocals and for everything else. But yeah, I don't have a chain that I use because again, like it's all so dependent on the sound. The more you use chains for creative stuff is totally fine. But like for mixing, I'd rather just know the few go-to plugins that I have and just add them and adjust them as needed. But if I put the whole chain on there, it's all going to be reacting totally differently because the source material is different. Maybe it's a different key, so all the frequencies are, shifted one way or another. Maybe the levels are hotter than in the last time I used the chain, so everything is getting pushed harder. It's really risky using chains unless you're willing to go through and adjust every single plugin. But for me, it just makes more sense to do it one at a time as it's needed. Trying to only ever use plugins when I have a reason. Like the way I tell my patrons in our Patreon feedback sessions, it's like, I want you to be able to tell me why every single plugin that you used is there and like defend it like you're a lawyer or something. Like if you can't give me a reason why you put that compressor on there, take it off. That's really how you grow into being a producer that knows what they're doing and isn't just throwing shit at the wall. There's plenty of producers who are super famous, super successful that don't know what they're doing, and that's, totally fine. I enjoy learning about this stuff. So like, I think my philosophy is a lot more like as little as possible, only what's necessary. I don't always follow my own rules, but I think if you can't tell someone why you're doing something, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. At least at the early stages. Once your ear is so trained, like if you're a professional, that you know exactly what sounds good, exactly what sounds bad, you don't really need to know why, because your ears tell you that, yes, this is good, yes, this is bad. But when you're first starting out, even your first 5 years of production, you can't really trust your ears because they can't hear everything yet. They're not trained, they're not developed because it hasn't been long enough. So it's easier to make good decisions if you don't overdo things and you don't throw stuff on just because you saw someone else do it. Hopefully everything I've just taught you guys is something you try, but not something you do by default, not something you just automatically autopilot, put on your vocals, whatever. Should be something you try to understand, you experiment with it, figure out when it works, when it doesn't, and then add that to your toolbox instead. Someone's asking if I mix everything around the kick. Yeah, so I usually just start the track with my kick around like -10 or so, and then build everything into that. And that gives you a lot more headroom. It makes sure you're not clipping, kind of forces you to turn down some of your synths, turn down some of your plugins, which helps with headroom and again, avoids clipping. So yeah, I like starting with plenty of headroom with the kick at -10. So it's a little past 2, so I gotta sign off, but hopefully this was really helpful for you guys. I'm recording it. I think Anjunadeep is as well though, so it should be up here. If you guys have questions, feel free to DM me on Instagram. If you found this helpful, if you like this method of learning, if me just kind of shouting at you for 2 hours, I think you'll really appreciate the Patreon page. The amount of improvement some of these patrons have gone through is like truly stunning. Like I'm shocked that where they used to be and where they are now, it's like pretty incredible. And I think if you're willing to put in the work, it's super valuable to learn from all these projects that I've done walkthroughs on. If you're willing to like actually watch, an hour video and take notes and try to learn from it. So it's not for the faint of heart, but if you're in it for the long run, I would highly recommend it. I've also got a Discord that we use with the Patreon, but it's free to join, and we talk about music stuff all the time. We do production tips and stuff like that. So all the links are on my Instagram story, or I'll post it right now because I don't think I can post links in YouTube. But yeah, thanks for everyone who joined. Hopefully this was helpful, and yeah, until next time, peace out.